Hello and welcome to Byju's IAS. Let's take up the analysis of today's The Hindu newspaper by looking at a column from page number 6 of the Delhi edition. This column deals with the outreach of the United States into the Southeast Asia region as a part of its Indo-Pacific policy. The writers of the column are of the opinion that the United States has begun a new kind of outreach towards the Southeast Asian countries. And according to them, this part of the American policy towards the Indo Pacific region is not just aimed at deterring China's rise. See, this column has been brought out because recently the US Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, paid an important visit to a few Southeast Asian countries such as Indonesia, Malaysia, and Thailand. During this visit, the US Secretary of State unveiled a new set of core principles that underlie the American policy towards the Indo Pacific region and also spelled out the adoption mechanisms for implementing these core foreign policy principles of the United States. See, the Southeast Asia region is represented by the ASEAN group. The ASEAN is a regional organization consisting of 10 Southeast Asian countries, and this political and economic grouping forms the central pillar of the Indo Pacific region. Both the United States and China are competing for influence in the Indo Pacific, and this not only brings them into a direct geopolitical confrontation, but it also leads them to rely heavily upon the ASEAN countries for promoting their respective economic and strategic interests. On one hand, the US has had close relations with several ASEAN countries such as Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand, Singapore, Philippines, and even with Vietnam to an extent. On the other hand, China has maintained very close strategic relations with Cambodia, Laos, and Myanmar. China, in particular, has remained heavily invested in the region and also exercises considerable leverage over every ASEAN country. Most of these ASEAN countries, including close American allies like Singapore and Indonesia, are heavily dependent on China, especially with regard to trade and investments. And this pushes all the ASEAN countries to not choose sides between US and China as far as possible. So close friends of the United States, like Singapore, Philippines, and Indonesia, even though they have very close strategic relations with the US, they don't often align with the US entirely because they are mindful of the leverage that China has over them. Because for all these ASEAN countries, China is a crucial trading partner and as well as an investor. And this pushes the ASEAN countries to strike a balance between the rising Chinese influence and the competing American influence. Traditionally, the American approach to counter China in the Indo Pacific has been to adopt a series of targeted policies against Chinese interests in the Indo Pacific. So, this has naturally brought US and China into a direct confrontation in the Indo Pacific. But, however, the writer points out that during the recent visit of the US Secretary of State, the US has taken a few deliberate steps with few Southeast Asian countries like Indonesia and Malaysia to strengthen the American Indo Pacific policy in general and not just with the aim of deterring China's rise and aggression. See, to understand this argument in detail, first you need to know about the significance of the Indo Pacific region. The Indo Pacific region, that stretches all the way from the Indian Ocean to the Pacific Ocean, has currently emerged as the hot spot for global geopolitics and the global economy. The economic and military rise of Asian powers like China, India, Japan, and of course the Southeast Asian countries has shifted the global hotspot for geopolitics and economic activities from the west towards the east. As a result, today's global economic growth engine is centered around the Indo Pacific region that stretches all the way from East Africa and West Asia to the west coast of North America and South America. But you also have several vital sea lanes of communication through which global trade is taking place through the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean. As China has risen as a global economic and military power over the last 2 decades, It has come to dominate these important sea lanes of communication, which facilitates global trade through the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean, especially in regions such as the South China Sea, East China Sea, and as well as near the Strait of Malacca, the Andaman Sea, and the Gulf of Aden. Across these critical regions of the Indo Pacific, China has emerged as a dominant economic and military power, which has directly challenged the traditional influence of the United States. As the US was largely preoccupied with the West and the Atlantic Ocean region, China registered a rapid rise in its influence beginning from the 1990s, and today has successfully emerged as the dominant economic and military power of the region. This rise of China in the Indo Pacific is largely centered on its excessive influence over the Southeast Asian countries. China not only happens to be a key trading partner of all these countries and a major investor, but it has also picked several territorial disputes with them, thus leading China to exercise great leverage over many Southeast Asian countries. Be it with Vietnam or Philippines or Indonesia, China not only exercises economic leverage over them, but also holds a strategic leverage over them by picking maritime disputes with them. As a part of this strategy, China has stepped up its military aggression in the South China Sea, and through open violation of international law under the UN clause or the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, China has made unilateral maritime claims in South China Sea, thus leading it into maritime disputes with all these Southeast Asian countries. So, to further its claims in the South China Sea, China has stepped up its military aggression and has even tried to disrupt freedom of navigation through the South China Sea, which happens to be a key link between the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean. But in this regard, Southeast Asian countries happen to be powerless against China, because if they choose to act against China, then China will brutally exercise its economic leverage over them by triggering trade wars with these countries and by disrupting investments in these countries. So China has essentially employed a combination of military and economic aggression in order to maintain its dominance in the region, and has been further gaining influence by making billions of dollars in investments through its ambitious Belt and Road Initiative. Even as China is locked in trade and territorial disputes with some of these countries, it has continued making strategic investments in infrastructure by helping these countries build critical infrastructure such as ports, road and railway networks, and as well as energy projects and special economic zones. China has proactively funded such critical projects through its Belt and Road Initiative, which has given it undisputable influence in the region, thus giving it the ability to display military and economic aggression that affects not just the Asian countries in the Indo Pacific, but also affects the traditional influence and the interests of the United States. The US, on the other hand, has been trying to counter this rising Chinese influence by launching its Pivot to Asia policy in 2009. Under the Pivot to Asia policy, the US has given itself a greater role in the Indo Pacific and has tried championing a free and open Indo Pacific in order to counter China's attempts at disrupting freedom of navigation in this important sea lane of communication, which is critical for global trade. As China has stepped up its maritime disputes in the South China Sea, and as it engages in more trade wars and leverages its investments, the US has also tried stepping up its military and economic influence by realigning its military and diplomatic strategies. As a part of this policy, the US has deployed its armed forces, including the US Navy, to protect freedom of navigation, which is guaranteed under the UN clause, and has frequently conducted freedom of navigation operations in the Indo Pacific in a direct challenge to China's military aggression. It has also extended diplomatic support to countries like Vietnam, Philippines, and Indonesia, which are locked in maritime disputes with China, and has even called for the implementation of the ruling of the International Tribunal on the Law of the Sea, which recognized the maritime claims of Philippines in 2016, while rejecting the counterclaims being made by China. Apart from this, the US has been crafting diplomatic and military alliances with other like-minded countries such as India, Japan, and Australia, and has formed a diplomatic grouping known as the Quad or the Quadrilateral, which is focused on protecting the geopolitical interests of the member countries against Chinese aggression in the Indo-Pacific. Then the recently formed AUKUS, which is a military alliance between Australia, UK, and US, also presents a direct military challenge to Chinese military aggression. Then, to counter Chinese investments and China's Belt and Road Initiative, the US has been backing the B3W or the Build Back Better World initiative of the G7 countries and has even been leading the Blue Dot Network along with Japan and Australia to promote infrastructure development in the Indo Pacific region. Under these two infrastructure initiatives, the US is looking to pool investments and provide billions of dollars to key countries such as ASEAN countries to help in the creation of critical infrastructure in these countries. So, as you can see, all these policies of the US under its Indo Pacific policy, they have been designed to directly counter China's military and economic aggression in the region. But in a departure from this direct confrontation approach, the US has unveiled a new chapter in its Indo Pacific policy, which is not just aimed at countering China's rise, but is in general designed to promote American influence in Southeast Asia. It was in this context that the US Secretary of State paid a visit to important Southeast Asian countries, and he underlined the core principles of the new American policy towards the Indo Pacific, while laying down the adoption mechanisms that could provide for the implementation of these core principles. Under this strategy, the US is appearing to indicate that its Indo Pacific policy is not just limited to deter or counter China, but is designed to promote American influence in the ASEAN region. Because the US now realizes that ASEAN countries, no matter what, are going to find it very difficult to choose sides between China and US. While it's a known fact that Southeast Asian countries like Cambodia, Laos, and Myanmar, they've been strategically aligned with China for several decades. The others, who are at the receiving end of Chinese aggression, like Indonesia, Singapore, Philippines, Vietnam, and even Malaysia and Thailand, they would hesitate to openly align with the US against China because they are worried about China punishing them economically or even through its military aggression, and hence a US military and economic policy that is purely focused on just countering China will not win the US enough support from these key countries. So, keeping this in mind, the US is bringing out a new chapter in its Indo Pacific policy that is not just aimed at deterring China, but is focused on laying out its 5 new core principles along with its adoption mechanisms. Through this new outreach, the US is looking to build strong trade and investment relations with the ASEAN countries that is independent of China's rise and activities in the region, so that the US need not be dependent on the support given by ASEAN countries for countering China's military and economic aggression in the region. The US knows for a fact that its traditional policy of countering China doesn't get enough support from the ASEAN countries, and hence it is looking to build truly meaningful relations with the ASEAN nations. Under this strategy, the US is looking to prioritize its investments in ASEAN infrastructure, along with helping the ASEAN countries in critical areas like technology, in creating resilient supply chains, in investing in clean energy and decarbonization, and also in promoting trade and labor standards across the region. For this, the US is looking to work with like minded partners under the Quadrilateral, and it is trying to channel billions of dollars in investments towards the ASEAN region through its B3W initiative or the Build Back Better World initiative, and as well as through its Blue Dot network. Such a policy of the United States aligns with the ASEAN outlook on the Indo Pacific because these American investments are not necessarily anti China, and the ASEAN countries would be more willing to engage with the US because otherwise they fully hesitate to embrace the United States and its policies as they fear a retribution from China. So, as long as the American policies are not solely designed to counter China, ASEAN countries would be more comfortable to engage with the US, thus giving US an opportunity to protect its traditional influence and interests in the Indo-Pacific. This ongoing realignment of the US Indo-Pacific policy is very important for India as well, because India happens to be a key pillar in this Indo-Pacific policy of the United States. India is not just a member of the Quadrilateral, but India also has very strong relations with the ASEAN group and the ASEAN countries. And the United States would be very eager to work with India on all these economic initiatives that are focused upon the Indo-Pacific region. Now let's take up an article from page number 1 and a related editorial from page number 6 that deals with the topic of reservation for economically weaker sections. See, in 2019, the 103rd Constitutional Amendment Act was enacted to provide for 10% reservation for economically weaker sections. This was the first time that reservation or quotas were being introduced on the basis of economic criteria. Prior to this, the Constitution recognized affirmative action only for those sections of the society which were socially and educationally backward. Hence, communities such as scheduled castes, scheduled tribes, and other backward classes, only they were eligible for reservation, both with regard to admissions into schools and colleges, and as well as with regard to government employment. Then in the 1990s, following the controversy surrounding OBC reservation, and following the landmark Indira Savni judgment of the Supreme Court, the concept of creamy layer was introduced for OBC reservation, according to which an income criteria was laid down for the OBC category to be eligible for reservation. After several revisions, this income criteria has been set at 8 lakhs per annum of annual family income, and those OBC families with the annual income lower than this threshold, only they would be eligible for OBC reservation. This concept of creamy layer was introduced so that the economically and socially well-off OBCs won't be eligible for reservation, whereas OBC quota could be kept reserved to the truly eligible candidates. So when the government introduced reservation for economically weaker sections through the 103rd Amendment, this was the first time that reservation was being provided on the basis of economic criteria, and hence it required the government to prescribe an economic limit or to prescribe an economic criteria for identifying the economically weaker sections who could be eligible for this 10% reservation. Interestingly, the government decided to keep the same income threshold, which was kept for the OBCs for defining the concept of creamy layer. So those general category candidates whose annual family income is less than 8 lakhs per annum were made eligible for this 10% reservation under the EWS category. This reservation policy of the government has run into several legal and constitutional challenges, and thus the constitutional validity of the 103rd Amendment has already been challenged at the Supreme Court. This constitutional challenge pertains to the basis for this reservation, which is granting reservation to the general category based on economic criteria. Because as discussed, the Constitution envisions reservation only for the socially, educationally backward classes. So on these grounds, the constitutional validity of the amendment itself has been challenged in a separate case at the Supreme Court. But recently, another case has been filed against EWS quota with regard to the income criteria that has been prescribed by the government. This new legal and constitutional challenge has ended up disrupting the NEET PG counseling, thus affecting medical admissions in the country. As you might know, the disruption caused to NEET PG counseling on the account of this legal challenge has already led to protests by resident doctors, and the government seems to be failing to overcome this legal hurdle, thus affecting not just the future of medical aspirants, but also the very validity of the 10% reservation that was provided to economically weaker sections through the 103rd Amendment. Say, with regard to NEET PG admissions, the government issued a notification in July 2021 announcing 27% reservation for OBCs and 10% reservation for economically weaker sections in the All India quota. Following this notification by the government, a batch of petitions were filed at the Supreme Court challenging the government's notification. The Supreme Court looked into the issue and issued a notice to the government in September, and after a few rounds of hearing, in October, the Supreme Court expanded the ambit of this case by seeking to check as to on what grounds this income criteria was determined by the government while granting 10% reservation to the economically weaker sections. The Supreme Court essentially questioned the government as to what was the basis for adopting 8 lakhs income, that is an annual family income of 8 lakhs, as the criteria to identify the EWS category. To this question by the Supreme Court, the government replied that the income criteria had been set with due consideration, but the Supreme Court was not impressed with this argument of the government. Then the Supreme Court directed the government to constitute a review committee, and accordingly in November, a review committee was set up to review the basis on which the income criteria was determined, along with suspending NEET PG counselling for the time being. Then this government-appointed committee carried out a review and submitted its report to the Supreme Court. And as per the committee's findings, the 8 lakh income criteria is feasible and reasonable, and has hence justified the decision of the government to set the income criteria at 8 lakhs per annum, which is also the same criteria used to determine creamy layer for OBC reservation. So in this context, the editorial on page number 6 questions the findings of this government-appointed committee and points out that the 8 lakh income criteria to identify EWS category has not been reasonably explained by the government. See, in the ongoing case related to NEET PG counselling, the Supreme Court has essentially questioned the government as to on what basis have you prescribed this income criteria for EWS category. For this question, the government-appointed review committee has said that the income threshold prescribed by the government is feasible and reasonable and has been determined following due consideration. But according to the editorial, this submission of the government-appointed committee is not sufficient to answer the questions that were being raised with the Supreme Court, and is definitely not adequate to justify the grounds on which the income criteria has been fixed for the EWS category. The editorial is pointing out that the question being raised with the Supreme Court is that on what basis is the same income criteria prescribed for OBCs and EWS category? Because on one hand, OBC reservation is on the grounds of social and educational backwardness, whereas EWS reservation is purely on the basis of economic criteria. If economic criteria is the basis for determining this 10% reservation, then the government will have to provide sufficient data and justification while prescribing the income limit. So for this, the government will have to take into account that purchasing power of people varies from region to region. Because in our country, we have a huge divide between the rural and urban areas. Consumption and expenditure is not the same in the rural and urban areas, and the purchasing power varies accordingly. Then even from state to state, as per capita income varies, the purchasing power of people in different states also varies. So if that is the case, how can the government determine a uniform income criteria of 8 lakhs per annum of annual family income as the threshold for granting economic reservation without providing further evidence or data to justify this reservation? The editorial notes that the government-appointed committee itself has acknowledged that the government has no data on what percentage of the population falls under the EWS category. So without such adequate data and without any empirical evidence, on what basis was the income criteria determined by the government? This is the question being raised with the Supreme Court, according to the editorial. The editorial goes on to point out that as per the findings of various consumption expenditure surveys like the NSSO report, a large percentage of our population has annual family income of less than 8 lakh rupees per annum. So in that case, a bulk of our population will become eligible for reservation under EWS category, which might end up defeating the very purpose of affirmative action. Because the Constitution is very clear that providing affirmative action in education and jobs has to be on established grounds such as social and educational backwardness. But now that the 103rd Amendment has introduced economic backwardness as a criteria, then the government will have to provide sufficient data, evidence, and justification to show on what basis is the income criteria being determined. According to the Supreme Court, the 8 lakh income criteria cannot be prescribed at random, but the government appointed committee seems to be failing to answer this question being raised by the Supreme Court. So, on one hand, we have a situation where the 103rd Amendment itself has been challenged on constitutional grounds, and now the Supreme Court has raised questions over the income criteria. So, these legal and constitutional hurdles are affecting the students, especially the medical aspirants, as the NEET PG counseling has been stalled, and hence the editorial is arguing that it is upon the government to provide sufficient justification to the Supreme Court to clear the legal and constitutional hurdles so that the policy of reservation is used wisely to benefit genuine and deserving candidates without causing unnecessary disruption to the process of admissions and recruitment. Now let's look at this article from page number 5. Constitutional validity of Dam Safety Act has been challenged in High Court. The DMK, a political party in Tamil Nadu, has moved the Madras High Court challenging the constitutional validity of the Dam Safety Act of 2021. The DMK has argued that this law enacted by the Parliament goes against the principles of federalism, which is a part of the basic structure of the Constitution, and has alleged that by enacting this law, the centre has gone beyond its legislative competence. It means that, according to the litigant, the central government does not have the legal jurisdiction to enact this law that deals with dam safety and dam regulation. So in this context, let's talk about this topic in complete detail. So the Dam Safety Bill was passed recently last month by the Rajya Sabha. It was first passed by the Lok Sabha in 2019 and recently it was also cleared by the Rajya Sabha. But this bill has generated a bit of controversy and has been opposed by few states, especially by Tamil Nadu. So first let's talk about the background and understand the context in which the bill has been introduced. See, India has the third largest number of dams in the world after China and the United States. There are around 5,700 large dams in the country and a few hundred more are being constructed. But many of these dams are old and about 80% of them are already over 25 years old. There are 227 other dams which are over 100 years old, but they are still functional. So the presence of so many dams, that to old dams, raises the question of dam safety. Because even though India has a good track record with regard to dam safety, there is no room for complacency because neglect of dam safety could result in unwarranted dam failures. Even though India has a decent record with dam safety, there was no legal or institutional architecture that provided for regulation of dams and its operations and its safety. Because unsafe dams pose a great hazard and any failure or breach of a dam could result in disasters such as massive floods and landslides which could cause huge loss of life and property. So it is in this context that the centre decided to bring in a law known as the Dam Safety Bill in order to create a legal and institutional architecture for regulating dam safety. This bill that has been passed by the Parliament provides for uniform dam safety standards and procedures across the country which should be implemented by all the states and union territories. The bill provides for surveillance, inspection, operation, and maintenance of all the specified dams, which have been classified into different categories based on their height and design and structural conditions. For this purpose, the bill constitutes two national level bodies known as the National Committee on Dam Safety and the National Dam Safety Authority. The National Committee on Dam Safety will be responsible for coming out with policies and recommendations to regulate all the aspects of dam safety standards, whereas the National Dam Safety Authority will be responsible for implementing these policies brought out by the National Committee. The authority will also be responsible for working with state dam safety organizations by providing the required technical assistance. and for resolving issues between states in case of interstate rivers. Then the Act also provides for the establishment of two state level bodies, one state committee on dam safety and another state dam safety organization. Similar to their national counterparts, the state committee will come out with the policies and regulations, whereas they will be implemented by the dam safety organization. So the functions and the jurisdiction of these institutions has been provided for in the schedules attached to the bill. But however, these schedules can be amended as and when needed by the central government through just a government notification. And any violation of these standards will be treated as an offense, which could even lead to imprisonment of up to 2 years or even a fine for those officials who are found to be in violation of these safety standards. But however, this bill has generated a lot of controversy, especially on two grounds. Since the bill applies for all specified dams in the country, it covers dams which have been built on not just interstate rivers but also on intrastate rivers. This is where a constitutional hurdle arises, because according to the Constitution, states have the sole jurisdiction for making laws with regard to water, which includes water storage and water power management. Essentially, water is a state subject as per the 7th schedule of the Indian Constitution. And also, most of the dams in the country are constructed, maintained by the states, whereas few larger dams are managed by autonomous bodies such as the Damodar Valley Corporation or the Bakra BS Management Board of the Bakra Nangal project. So essentially, the center does not have any direct jurisdiction when it comes to regulation of dams. However, when it comes to interstate rivers and dams which are built on interstate rivers, then the parliament and the center, they do exercise jurisdiction. And even on the account of disaster management, the parliament and the center exercise jurisdiction, because adherence to dam safety standards and the consequences of the failure of a dam, they fall under disaster management. But however, few states have raised legal and constitutional questions on whether the parliament has jurisdiction to regulate the operation of dams, that too on rivers which are flowing entirely within a state. It's on these grounds that the government of Tamil Nadu and the political parties in Tamil Nadu have raised a constitutional question and they have challenged the constitutional validity of the law. According to them, this law represents a breach of federalism, and hence the DMK has moved the Madras High Court by stating that the center has no legal competence to frame laws in this subject, because the provisions of the law and the powers that are being given to the national institutions will directly conflict with the powers of the states with regard to water management. The second concern being raised is that the functions of all the institutions being created, that is the National Committee on Dam Safety, National Dam Safety Authority, and the state level counterparts, their functions have been listed in schedules attached to the bill. And these functions, they can be amended by the central government through just a government notification. So here again a constitutional question arises whether the center has the powers to amend a law passed with the parliament through just a government notification. Shouldn't such amendments be carried out by the parliament itself and not merely through a notification issued by the government of India? So on these constitutional grounds, the law has generated a lot of controversy and few states are opposing it, and they have even challenged the constitutional validity of the law. But the center has justified the law by stating that Parliament and center have enough jurisdiction to frame such laws because the issue deals with the subject of disaster management, and also the Constitution does provide jurisdiction for center and Parliament over the management of interstate river valleys. Now let's look at the mains practice questions. The first question: America's Indo-Pacific policy and its foray into Southeast Asia is not just aimed at deterring China's rise. Discuss. The second question: the 103rd Constitutional Amendment was introduced to extend the benefits of reservation to the economically weaker sections. But the annual income limit criteria which has been fixed to identify the beneficiaries has not been reasonably explained by the government, leading to legal and constitutional issues. Critically examine. So kindly write an answer to these questions and post your answers in the answer writing portal, for which the link shall be given in the description box below. With this, let's conclude our discussion for today. Thanks for watching.